When the snow blankets the ground and silence falls, the dark can seem endless, but some winter nights hide stories so chilling, they'll make you second-guess stepping outside after dark. Tonight, we bring you 3 terrifying tales from Reddit. Real accounts of eerie encounters that will send shivers down your spine. Stay until the end for the scariest story that has never been solved. And if you enjoy spine-tingling stories like these, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Story 1. The Cabin in the Woods. It was mid-December when Alex decided to book the cabin. He needed a break from the chaos of city life. A chance to disconnect from the endless noise, the stress of work, and the constant ping of notifications on his phone. The cabin, nestled deep in the woods and surrounded by a blanket of snow, seemed perfect. The photos online showed a rustic wooden structure with a stone fireplace and large windows that looked out into the wilderness. The idea of spending a few days alone, writing and drinking hot coffee by the fire, filled Alex with anticipation. But from the moment he arrived, something felt off. As he stepped out of his car and crunched through the snow to the cabin's front door, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He paused, turning to scan the surrounding trees. The forest was quiet, eerily so. No birds chirping, no wind rustling through the branches. Just silence. Shrugging it off his nerves, Alex grabbed his bag and stepped inside. The cabin was cold but cozy. The wood panel walls glowed warmly in the late afternoon sunlight, filtering through the windows. After unpacking, he lit the fireplace, made a cup of tea, and sank into the old armchair by the hearth. For a while, he felt at ease. That night, however, things began to change. Alex woke up around 2 a.m. to a faint noise outside. At first, he thought it was the wind, just the trees groaning under the weight of the snow. But as he lay still, straining to listen, he realized the sound was more deliberate. It was a crunching noise, like footsteps on snow, circling the cabin. His heart began to race. He sat up in bed, staring toward the window, but the curtains were drawn, and the room was pitch dark. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. Alex tried to convince himself it was just a deer or some other animal. But sleep didn't come easily after that. The next morning, he stepped outside to find the snow around the cabin pristine, except for a set of footprints. They were large, unmistakably human, and led from the edge of the woods straight to the front door. But here's what unsettled Alex the most. The footprints didn't lead away. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the tracks. The cabin was miles from the nearest road, and the snow had been untouched when he arrived. There was no logical explanation. Trying to brush off his unease, Alex told himself it must have been a hiker passing through. He spent the day hiking the nearby trails, keeping an eye out for anyone else, but he didn't see another soul. That night, the noises started again. It was subtle at first, branches snapping, like something moving just beyond the tree line. Alex turned off the lights, peered out the window, and saw nothing but darkness. Then came the whispers. They were faint, barely audible, like someone murmuring just beneath his window. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, shining the beam into the trees. The light illuminated the snow and the dense, black forest beyond, but nothing moved. Still, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. When he stepped back inside, something was different. The air in the cabin felt colder, heavier, like a presence lingered. He locked the door and checked all the windows, telling himself he was just being paranoid. The following morning, Alex woke up to find the kitchen in disarray. A chair was overturned and his coffee mug lay shattered on the floor. At first, he thought he'd forgotten to clean up the night before, but the memory of leaving everything in order was crystal clear. Later, as he was writing by the fire, he heard a loud thump from the bedroom. Startled, Alex jumped up and hurried to check. The closet door was open, though he was certain he'd closed it earlier. His suitcase, which had been on the floor, was now on the bed, unzipped. That's when he began to feel truly scared. He called the property manager, who assured him no one else had access to the cabin. "It's probably just the old place settling," the manager said. "Happens all the time in the winter." But Alex wasn't convinced. He couldn't explain the footprints, the noises, or the way things seemed to move when he wasn't looking. That night, the sounds outside grew louder and more persistent. The footsteps circled the cabin again, slower this time, almost as if whoever or whatever was out there wanted to be heard. Alex stayed in bed, gripping a flashlight and a kitchen knife, his ears straining for any sound. Then, just as he was starting to think the noises had stopped, he heard a creak, the unmistakable sound of the front door opening. His heart thundered as he crept out of bed and toward the living room. The door was still locked, but the floorboards creaked softly, as though someone was walking inside. Alex turned on every light in the cabin, hoping to scare off whatever was there, but the rooms were empty. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him from the shadows. The next morning, Alex decided he'd had enough. He packed his things and was ready to leave when he noticed something chilling. In the frost on the bedroom window, a single word had been written: "Stay." His stomach dropped. There were no footprints outside the window, no sign that anyone had been there. Terrified, Alex grabbed his bag, got in his car, and drove away, not daring to look back. The decision to leave couldn't come soon enough for Alex. By the fourth night, his nerves were completely frayed. Sleep eluded him, and every creak, snap, or whisper seemed amplified by the oppressive silence of the forest. It was just past midnight when Alex heard it again, those slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. He sat frozen on the couch, clutching his flashlight, when something caught his eye through the living room window. A figure, standing just beyond the tree line. It was hard to make out in the dim moonlight. It wasn't moving, just standing there, barely visible through the thin veil of snow drifting down. Alex's breath hitched. His first instinct was to turn off the lights, but he stopped himself, not wanting to plunge the cabin into total darkness. Instead, he grabbed the flashlight and moved closer to the window. The figure was tall, its form shadowy and indistinct, but there was no mistaking it was staring directly at the cabin. Hands trembling, Alex threw open the front door and shone the flashlight into the trees. Nothing. The figure had vanished, leaving only untouched snow where it had been. No footprints, no sign that anyone or anything had been there. Alex slammed the door shut, his chest heaving as panic set in. He checked every lock and window twice, but the sense of safety he sought didn't come. He felt trapped, surrounded by the unknown. As he paced the cabin, debating whether to call for help, Alex's foot struck something beneath the couch. Frowning, he crouched down and pulled out a dusty, leather-bound book. A journal. The handwriting was messy, the ink faded, but as Alex flipped through the pages, his blood ran cold. The entries described experiences eerily similar to his own. Whispers outside the cabin, footsteps circling in the snow, a figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching. One passage stood out. "It doesn't want you to leave. It wants you to stay. I see it every night now, closer and closer. I fear I'll be next." Alex slammed the book shut and stuffed it into his bag. He didn't want to read anymore. He didn't want to know. He just wanted to get out of that place. At dawn, Alex threw his belongings into the car and sped down the snowy road, barely sparing a glance at the cabin in his rearview mirror. The sense of dread lingered, like a weight on his chest. Even as he drove further and further away, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, and for a split second he thought he saw something. Just a flicker of movement in the back seat. But when he whipped around to check, the car was empty. By the time he reached home, he'd convinced himself it was his imagination. But as Alex unpacked his bag later that night, he found the journal sitting on top, though he distinctly remembered shoving it to the bottom. Its cover was scratched as though someone or something had clawed at it. And on the first blank page, a message had appeared in the same handwriting as the journal entries. "You'll be back." Alex never returned to the cabin, but the experience stayed with him, haunting his dreams and making him question what was real. What would you have done in Alex's situation? Could this have been something supernatural, or was someone sinister lurking in the shadows? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this chilling story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more terrifying tales. Story 2. The Frozen Hitchhiker. The snowstorm came out of nowhere. 1 minute. The sky was clear and the road ahead stretched out endlessly. The next, fat flakes of snow were swirling in chaotic patterns, blanketing the world in white. Claire tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles pale under the dim glow of the dashboard lights. She was heading home after visiting her family, a 2-hour drive through a desolate stretch of highway cutting through the mountains. The storm had made the already lonely road feel otherworldly. The headlights barely cut through the dense snowfall, and the radio crackled with static, leaving her alone with the muffled roar of the heater and the rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers. It was late, too late, she thought, to be out on a road like this. But staying overnight hadn't been an option, and now all she wanted was the comfort of her own bed. The eerie quiet of the snow-covered highway was getting under her skin. The road was completely deserted. No other cars, no lights, just a thick, oppressive storm pressing in on all sides. That's when she saw it, a figure by the side of the road. At first, Claire thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. The snow made it hard to see clearly, but as she drew closer, the figure came into focus. A man, waving both arms frantically, his outline barely visible through the flurry of snow. Her heart leapt into her throat. What was someone doing out here in the middle of nowhere in a storm like this? She slowed the car as she approached, her headlights illuminating the figure. The man was bundled in a heavy coat, his face partially obscured by a scarf, but his eyes, wide and desperate, were unmistakable. He looked terrified. Claire hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to keep driving, to not get involved. But then she thought of the cold, the isolation. What if it were stranded out here? She couldn't just leave him. Taking a deep breath, she pulled over and rolled down the passenger window just enough to speak. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice shaky. The man leaned down, his breath fogging the air between them. "Please," he said, his voice hoarse. "I need to get out of here. They're coming." The word sent a chill down Claire's spine, and not just because of the cold. "Who's coming?" she asked, but the man didn't answer. Instead, he opened the door and climbed in without waiting for an invitation. The man slammed the door shut and huddled into the seat, shaking uncontrollably. Snow clung to his coat and hair, melting into tiny rivers that ran down his face. Claire tried to calm her racing heart as she started driving again. "Where are you headed?" she asked, her voice tight. "Anywhere but here," the man muttered. His eyes darted to the rear-view mirror, then to the side windows, as if expecting someone or something to appear. Claire frowned. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared out the window, his hands gripping the edge of the seat so tightly his knuckles turned white. "The snow hides them," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "What?" "They can't see us in the storm," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "But we can't stop. If we stop, they'll find us." Claire's pulse quickened. "Who are you talking about?" The man turned to her, his eyes wide and filled with an intensity that made her stomach churn. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," he said. "Just keep driving." Claire's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Every instinct told her something was off about this man. His cryptic words, his frantic demeanor, it didn't add up. "Look," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "if you're in danger, I can call for help. The police." "No!" The man snapped, cutting her off. His outburst made her jump. "No police. No one can help. Just keep driving. Please." The storm grew worse as they drove on. The snow fell heavier, the wind howling against the car like an animal trying to break in. The road ahead was barely visible, and Claire's nerves were wearing thin. The man hadn't said much since his initial outburst, but his presence filled the car with an oppressive tension. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his leg bouncing nervously. Finally, Claire couldn't take it anymore. "Listen," she said, her voice sharp. "You need to tell me what's going on. Who are you running from?" The man hesitated, his jaw working as if he were chewing on the words. "I saw them," he said finally. "Out there, in the woods. They don't belong here." Claire felt a shiver creep up her spine. "What do you mean?" "They're not human," the man whispered. "Not anymore." Claire opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the car jolted as something slammed into it from the side. "What the—" She fought to keep control of the car as it skidded on the icy road, her heart pounding in her chest. "What was that?" she demanded. The man didn't answer. He was staring out the window, his face pale as a sheet. "They're here," he said, his voice trembling. Claire's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, but all she saw was swirling snow. "I don't see anything." "You won't," the man said. "Not until it's too late." The tension in the car was suffocating as Claire pushed the gas pedal harder, the engine groaning in protest. The road was slick, and the visibility was next to nothing, but she didn't dare slow down. The man suddenly leaned forward, pointing frantically out the windshield. "There!" he shouted. Claire squinted, her stomach dropping as she saw a figure standing in the middle of the road, completely still despite the storm raging around them. "Don't stop!" the man screamed. Claire's hands shook as she swerved to avoid the figure, the car sliding dangerously close to the edge of the road. When she glanced in the rear-view mirror, the figure was gone. "What the hell is going on?" she yelled, her voice cracking. But the man didn't answer. He was staring straight ahead, his face frozen in terror. The storm seemed to grow louder, the wind shrieking like a living thing. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the snow cleared, revealing a small, abandoned gas station up ahead. Claire pulled into the parking lot, her hands trembling as she killed the engine. She turned to ask the man what they should do next, but the passenger seat was empty. The storm was relentless, snow hammering against the windshield and reducing visibility to just a few feet. Claire's knuckles ached from gripping the steering wheel so tightly, and her heart pounded in her chest as the strange man beside her muttered cryptic warnings. "The snow hides them," he whispered again, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. "But it doesn't mean we're safe." Claire's nerves were frayed. She had been driving for nearly an hour with the stranger, her unease growing with every passing mile. His wild eyes darted around the car, his breathing shallow and fast. Despite the storm, she could feel beads of sweat forming on her forehead. "You need to explain what's going on," she said, trying to sound firm, though her voice quivered. "Who's after you? What's out there?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he pressed himself further into the seat, his hands gripping his knees so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Claire glanced at him, her frustration bubbling over. "Look, if you're not going to talk, then I'm taking you to the nearest town and dropping you off." "No!" the man snapped, turning to her with wide, panicked eyes. "You can't stop. They're following us." "Who is following us?" Claire demanded. The man opened his mouth as if to answer, but before he could, a loud thump echoed through the car, making Claire jump. "What was that?" she gasped, her heart hammering in her chest. The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned to look out the back window, his face pale as a sheet. Claire's pulse raced as she glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, lurking in the storm. But there was nothing there, just the swirling snow. "It's them," the man whispered. "That's it," Claire said, slamming her hand against the steering wheel. "I'm pulling over. I don't care what's out there. I need answers." She turned her head to confront him, but the passenger seat was empty. Claire's breath caught in her throat, her heart thundered in her chest as her eyes darted around the car. The seatbelt was still buckled, the fabric of the seat damp where the man had been sitting, but he was gone. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. "Where did you go?" The only response was the howling wind outside. Panic set in. Had he jumped out of the car? Was he hurt? Claire slowed the car, her mind racing. She reached over and touched the seat where he had been sitting. It was cold. Too cold. "No, no, no," she muttered, shaking her head. "This isn't happening." She checked the mirrors again, but the road behind her was as empty as the road ahead. Shaken, Claire kept driving, her mind replaying the events of the last hour. She couldn't explain what had just happened. She had picked up a man. She was certain of that. She had spoken to him, argued with him, and now he was gone, leaving nothing behind but a cold, damp seat and an overwhelming sense of dread. When she finally reached the small town where she lived, the storm had started to let up. The familiar streets, usually comforting, felt strange and unwelcoming. She pulled into her driveway and sat in the car for a long time, staring at the empty passenger seat. She couldn't bring herself to go inside, not yet. Instead, she reached for her phone and searched for news about the area where she had picked up the hitchhiker. Maybe there had been an accident, or maybe someone else had reported seeing him. But what she found left her cold. There was an old story, a local legend, about a hitchhiker who had disappeared during a snowstorm on that same stretch of highway years ago. According to the tale, the man had been fleeing from something, but no one ever found out what. He was last seen flagging down cars for help, just like she had seen him. Claire's stomach churned as she read the account. Witnesses had described the hitchhiker's frantic demeanor, his cryptic warnings. The details were identical to her experience. And then she came across the part that made her blood run cold. The hitchhiker's body had never been recovered. Claire's hands trembled as she set her phone down. She sat in the silence of the car, the storm outside reduced to a gentle flurry, her mind racing. Had she really picked up a ghost? The rational part of her tried to dismiss the thought, but the unease in her gut told her otherwise. She had felt the man's presence, had heard his voice, had seen the fear in his eyes. But now, all that was left was a question that would haunt her for years to come. Was he trying to escape something or warn her about it? From that night on, Claire avoided that stretch of highway. She couldn't bear to drive it again, not knowing what or who she might encounter. Even now, on stormy nights, when the wind howls and the snow falls thick, she sometimes catches herself glancing in her rear-view mirror, half expecting to see him sitting there again, his wide, terrified eyes staring back at her. What would you have done in Claire's situation? Do you believe the hitchhiker was real, or was it just her mind playing tricks in the storm? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales. Story 3. The Frozen Shadow. The blizzard had started hours earlier, turning the quiet rural landscape into an unrecognizable blur of white. Anna sat curled up on her couch, wrapped in a thick blanket, trying to focus on the novel in her hands. The fire crackled weakly in the fireplace, barely cutting through the chill that seeped into every corner of her old farmhouse. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and making the wooden beams of the house groan. Beyond the frosted glass, the world was nothing but a swirling mass of snow. Anna had always loved winters in the countryside, until tonight. For the first time, the isolation didn't feel peaceful. It felt oppressive, suffocating. She couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and glanced at the window. The frost had crept in from the edges, obscuring her view, but something caught her eye. Movement. Leaning forward, she squinted through the glass. At first, she thought it was just the snow shifting in the wind, but then she saw it, a tall, shadowy figure standing in the field behind her house, motionless against the swirling storm. Anna's breath caught in her throat. She told herself it was nothing, probably just a tree or a trick of the light. But as she watched, the figure moved. It wasn't random movement, either. The figure began pacing back and forth, its dark form contrasting sharply against the snow. Anna's heart raced. She lived miles away from her nearest neighbor, and there was no reason for anyone to be out here, especially in this weather. She grabbed her phone, but the screen displayed the dreaded message. No signal. Of course, the storm had knocked out service, just like it always did in bad weather. Her pulse quickened as she peered back through the window. The figure had stopped pacing and was now facing the house. Anna's stomach churned. The rational part of her brain insisted it was just a lost traveler seeking shelter, but another part, a deeper, instinctual part, screamed at her to stay hidden, to lock the doors and turn off the lights. She watched for what felt like an eternity, her breath fogging up the glass. Then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Despite the figure's movements, the snow beneath it remained untouched. There were no footprints. Anna stumbled back from the window, her mind racing. She tried to think logically. Maybe the snow was covering the tracks as quickly as they were made. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. Anna felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the figure outside could see straight through the walls of her home. Gathering her courage, she grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and went to the back door. She told herself she would shine the light out there, see the figure up close, and prove to herself it was nothing to be afraid of. Her hands shook as she unlocked the door and cracked it open. The icy wind rushed in, biting at her face and making her gasp. She pointed the flashlight toward the field, its beam cutting through the storm. But the light didn't reach far, and the figure was gone. Anna stepped back inside and locked the door, her heart pounding. She wanted to believe it had been her imagination, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Suddenly, there was a loud thud from the roof above her. Anna froze, her eyes darting to the ceiling. The sound came again, a heavy, deliberate thud, followed by the creak of footsteps. Her breath hitched as she backed away from the door, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The footsteps moved across the roof, stopping directly above her. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice trembling. The only response was the howling wind. The footsteps began again, this time moving toward the edge of the roof. Anna ran to the front window, her heart hammering in her chest. Through the frost-covered glass, she saw the shadowy figure standing in her front yard, staring directly at the house. She stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. When she looked up again, the figure was gone. Anna didn't sleep that night. She stayed huddled by the fire, clutching a kitchen knife and jumping at every sound. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world bright and pristine. She cautiously stepped outside, scanning the area where she had seen the figure. The snow was undisturbed, no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. She tried to convince herself it had all been a nightmare brought on by the storm and her imagination. But as she turned to go back inside, something caught her eye, a single blackened handprint on the frosted window. The shadowy figure outside stopped pacing. Its dark form was still as a statue, yet somehow even more unsettling in its stillness. Anna's breath quickened as she realized it wasn't just standing. It was facing the house. No! It was staring straight at her through the frosted window. Her pulse thundered in her ears. For a moment, she convinced herself that it couldn't possibly see her. The interior lights were dim, and she was huddled behind the edge of the curtain. But deep down, Anna couldn't shake the overwhelming certainty that the figure was looking directly into her eyes, even from that distance. Suddenly, the figure tilted its head ever so slightly, as if curious. The movement was unnaturally slow and deliberate, like something imitating human behavior rather than embodying it. A sharp pang of panic surged through her chest. She backed away from the window, her gaze locked on the shadow. With trembling hands, she grabbed the edge of the curtain and yanked it closed. The room plunged into partial darkness, the only light coming from the weak glow of the fire. But Anna couldn't stop herself from imagining the figure still out there, staring at the house, waiting. The tapping began. At first, it was faint, just a soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap against the glass. She froze, her entire body stiff with fear. The sound came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the same window where she had seen the figure. Anna clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. She couldn't bring herself to move. The tapping grew more insistent, as if demanding her attention. "Who's there?" she croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. The tapping stopped. The silence was worse. The absence of sound felt heavy, oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Then, from the window behind her, came a louder, sharper bang. Anna spun around, her back pressed against the wall. Her eyes darted toward the source of the noise, but the blinds were drawn tight. She couldn't see anything, but she could feel it, the oppressive sensation of being watched. Her legs felt like lead as she crept toward the window, her heart hammering in her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but a morbid curiosity kept her moving. Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted the edge of the blind. The figure was gone. Anna exhaled shakily, a momentary relief washing over her. But it didn't last. As she stepped back, her foot knocked over the flashlight she dropped earlier. The metallic clang echoed through the room, startling her. And then she saw it. On the frosted window pane, just where the figure had been standing outside, was a message. The letters were crude, jagged, as if scrawled by a finger in the frost. "Let me in." Anna's blood ran cold. Her mind raced with explanations, but none of them made sense. She stumbled back from the window, her eyes glued to the chilling message. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." She grabbed her phone again, praying for a signal. Nothing. The storm had rendered her completely isolated. She thought about grabbing her car keys and driving to safety, but the thought of stepping outside, of being exposed, made her stomach churn. Instead, she did the only thing she could think of. She locked every door and window, drew every curtain, and turned off every light in the house. She sat in the corner of the living room, clutching the flashlight and kitchen knife, her ears straining for any sound. The rest of the night passed in a haze of terror. Every creak of the house, every whistle of the wind, sent her heart racing. She didn't dare sleep. She didn't even dare close her eyes. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the storm, Anna finally mustered the courage to move. The snow outside was pristine, untouched by human hands or footprints. She cautiously approached the window and wiped away the frost with her sleeve. The message was still there. Her stomach churned as she realized something else. The letters were on the inside of the glass. What do you think Anna experienced that night? Was it a ghostly visitor, a hallucination born of isolation, or something far more sinister? Share your theories in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more chilling stories like this one.